Picture a small fire, low and orange, inside a limestone shelter somewhere in what is now northern Iraq. It is roughly 50,000 years ago. A woman sits close to the flame, and in her arms is an infant whose breathing is shallow, whose skin is warm in a way that worries her. Around her, a handful of other adults move through the routines of the evening tending the fire, working a hide, murmuring to one another, but every so often, one of them glances over. Someone brings water. Someone else shifts closer, offering warmth, offering hands. There is no medicine in the way we would recognize it. There is no diagnosis. There is only a group of people genuinely uncertain about what will happen next, doing what they can. That image raises an obvious question, and then, underneath it, a considerably more interesting one. The surface-level question is simple. Did ancient humans try to save sick infants, or did they abandon them? The deeper, more interesting underlying question is this. What does the way early humans responded to a sick baby reveal about the actual architecture of human caregiving itself? The parts of us that are almost certainly older than culture, older than agriculture, older than language as we know it? That second question is the one that actually matters, because the first one has no single answer, and chasing it as if it does will only mislead you. Spoiler, the honest answer is that ancient humans, across an enormous span of time and geography, overwhelmingly tried to care for sick infants. And they did so using a cooperative support system that was genuinely built into our species long before written history began. But that answer needs considerable unpacking, because trying to care did not always mean succeeding. And the constraints on that care were brutal in ways that are difficult for a modern audience to fully absorb. To understand why, we need to start with something researchers studying human evolution call the Cooperative Breeding Hypothesis, and it is genuinely foundational to almost everything else in this video. Human infants are, biologically speaking, an anomaly among primates. They are born considerably underdeveloped compared to other apes unable to cling, unable to regulate their own body temperature efficiently, unable to do almost anything except cry, feed, and eat up enormous amounts of caloric and time investment from the people around them. This is sometimes called secondary altriciality, and it is largely a byproduct of two competing evolutionary pressures: a pelvis shaped for walking upright, which limits how large a baby's head can be at birth, and a brain that keeps growing at a fetal-like rate for years after birth. The result is a creature that is almost helpless for an extraordinarily long stretch of its early life, and that helplessness had to be paid for somehow. The way it was paid for, researchers like anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy have argued, was not solely through the mother. It was through what's called alloparenting, a support network of fathers, older siblings, grandmothers, and unrelated group members who all contributed calories, protection, and direct care to a given infant. This is genuinely unusual among great apes, most of which rely almost entirely on the mother alone. Human infant survival, in other words, was never designed to be a one-person job. It was a group project from the very beginning, and that has enormous implications for what happens when a baby gets sick. There's a related idea worth understanding here too, sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, which proposes that human females evolved an unusually long post-reproductive lifespan specifically because older women who were no longer bearing children of their own could redirect considerable time and energy toward the survival of their grandchildren. This hypothesis remains debated in its specifics, but the broader pattern it points to is genuinely well-supported human childrearing has, for a very long time, relied on considerably more hands than just a mother's two. When a baby became sick, that support network wasn't a bonus feature layered on top of parenting. It was, essentially, the very system that had evolved to absorb exactly this kind of crisis. Now, let's address something genuinely important before we go further. Because the honest answer here is considerably more complicated than everyone was always cared for. Across the archaeological and ethnographic record, there is also clear evidence that some human societies practiced infanticide, or selective non-investment, particularly in cases of severe congenital illness, disability, or extreme resource scarcity. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a well-documented one, discussed extensively in the anthropological literature on hunter-gatherer demography. The honest answer is genuinely complicated, and it depends heavily on context, the severity of the illness, the resources available to the group at that moment, the number of dependents already being supported, and the specific cultural framework the group operated within. Care was the dominant pattern, almost certainly, but it was not universal, and treating it as universal would be its own kind of distortion. To make this less abstract, let's zoom into one specific, well-documented case. At the Windover Pond archaeological site in Florida, dated to roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, archaeologists excavated dozens of burials preserved in waterlogged peat, which allowed for unusually good preservation of skeletal material. Among those burials was a child, generally estimated to have died around age 15, who had lived with spina bifida, a serious congenital spinal condition that, without any modern intervention, would have caused significant mobility impairment from birth. The genuinely striking part is not the diagnosis itself, but the burial. This child was interred with care, wrapped, and accompanied by grave goods, in a manner consistent with the burials of other children at the site. That single case does not prove anything about all ancient humans everywhere, but it does provide considerably concrete, physical evidence that at least one small hunter-gatherer community sustained a chronically ill child for over a decade, well past infancy, using labor and resources the entire group had to help supply. Let's bring up paleopathology first, because this is the evidence category that lets researchers see care happening directly on bone. When a person survives a serious illness or injury, their skeleton often records it healed fractures, evidence of infection that the body fought off, bone remodeling that indicates months or years of survival after an initial trauma. Skeletons showing these kinds of healed, long-survived conditions appear across the Paleolithic and Neolithic record. And they are genuinely significant because healing of that kind requires sustained provisioning. An individual with a severely limiting injury or illness generally cannot forage, hunt, or fully provide for themselves during recovery, which means someone else was almost certainly bringing them food and water for an extended period. Let's bring up grave treatment next, because how a community buries someone tells you something about how that person was regarded in life. Infant and child burials from numerous Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites show deliberate positioning, red ochre application, and inclusion of ornaments or tools treatment that mirrors and sometimes exceeds the burial care given to adults. This doesn't mean every sick infant received an elaborate burial, but it does suggest that infants, including presumably infants who had been ill, were considerably integrated into a community's symbolic and emotional world rather than treated as disposable. Let's bring up ethnographic parallels next, because we can supplement the ancient physical record with observations of recent and existing hunter-gatherer societies, whose subsistence patterns likely resemble those of deep prehistory more closely than industrial or agricultural societies do. Anthropological fieldwork among groups such as the Hadza, the aka, and the Kung has documented extensive cooperative infant care, with fathers, grandmothers, and other group members contributing direct childcare labor at rates considerably higher than in many post-agricultural societies. This provides a living model imperfect, but genuinely useful for how alloparenting likely functioned tens of thousands of years earlier. Let's bring up the biological substrate of caregiving next, because the behavior itself has a neurochemical basis that predates human culture entirely. Oxytocin and related bonding hormones, present across mammals, drive caregiving responses to infant distress cues. Crying, in particular, appears to be an evolved signal specifically shaped to be difficult for adult humans to ignore. Researchers studying infant cry acoustics have found that certain cry patterns reliably trigger heightened physiological arousal in listening adults, essentially functioning as a biological alarm that recruits help. A sick infant, crying more or crying differently, would have been triggering that alarm considerably more insistently than usual. Here's where we hit a piece of evidence that remains genuinely debated among researchers, and it deserves to be presented fairly rather than resolved artificially. Some skeletal assemblages, particularly certain Neolithic and Bronze Age infant burial patterns showing unusually high proportions of neonatal deaths clustered in specific contexts, have been interpreted by some researchers as potential evidence of selective infanticide tied to resource stress, birth spacing, or in a few contested cases, sex-selective practices. Other researchers studying the same assemblages argue that these patterns are more plausibly explained by natural neonatal mortality rates, which were extraordinarily high in all pre-modern populations regardless of parental behavior, combined with taphonomic factors, meaning the way fragile infant bones preserve or fail to preserve over thousands of years that can distort the apparent ratios. Both interpretations have credible defenders, and the honest answer is that, without direct evidence of cause of death, which skeletal material essentially never provides for something like exposure or neglect, this particular question likely cannot be fully resolved with current methods. It's worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than resolving it for the sake of a tidy narrative. As we move from deep prehistory into written history, the evidence changes shape entirely. It becomes considerably more direct, because now people are telling us, in their own words, what they thought about sick children. In ancient Mesopotamia, medical texts inscribed on clay tablets include diagnostic and prognostic instructions specifically for infant ailments, alongside incantations meant to accompany treatment, suggesting illness in infants was treated as a serious problem worth dedicated intellectual and ritual effort. In ancient Egypt, papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus, contain sections addressing pediatric conditions, including remedies for fever, digestive distress, and respiratory illness in young children, indicating a genuinely sustained medical tradition focused on childhood disease. Ancient Greek medical writings, including portions of the Hippocratic corpus, likewise devote attention to childhood fevers and convulsions, treating them as conditions to be actively managed rather than simply endured. What's genuinely striking here is not that these ancient societies discovered caregiving, the underlying instinct, was already tens of thousands of years old by this point, but that the cultural packaging around it had become considerably more elaborate. Care that once looked like a woman by a fire and a few concerned relatives now looked like professionalized healers, written formularies, and institutional medical knowledge. The mechanism stayed the same. The expression of it scaled up with civilization. It's worth bringing modern science back into this conversation, because contemporary research gives tangible, present-day support to the ancient pattern we've been describing. Forensic and bioarchaeological techniques, including isotopic analysis of infant and child bones, now allow researchers to reconstruct weaning patterns, nutritional stress, and even seasonal illness episodes in individuals who died thousands of years ago, essentially reading a biography out of bone chemistry. Separately, contemporary neonatal research on NICU environments has documented that skin-to-skin contact, sustained caregiver presence, and responsive attention to distress cues measurably improve outcomes for fragile infants mechanisms that are almost certainly the modern echo of the same alloparenting instincts that kept ancient infants alive. The specific tools have changed considerably, but researchers keep finding the same underlying human behavior at the center of the data. Proximity and responsiveness to a sick infant produces better outcomes in every era we have evidence for. It's important to push back here against a subtle but genuinely common mistake, which is treating ancient humans as a single, uniform population with one shared answer to this question. Asking how ancient humans treated sick babies as if every member of an entire population spread across tens of thousands of years and every continent on Earth behaved identically is exactly as flawed as asking the same question about the 8 billion people alive today. A forager band in glacial-era Europe facing a brutal winter with dwindling food stores, was operating under a genuinely different calculus than a settled agricultural community in a fertile river valley with stored grain reserves. Individual temperament mattered too. Some caregivers, then as now, were almost certainly more anxious, more devoted, more skilled, or more overwhelmed than others. There was never one ancient way. There were countless individual decisions shaped by circumstance, made by people who were, in every meaningful psychological sense, exactly like us. There are also a couple of overlooked dimensions worth adding here, because the picture is considerably richer than illness severity alone. One is, social status ethnographic and historical evidence suggests that an infant's perceived investment value could be shaped by the mother's standing within the group, by whether the infant had surviving older siblings competing for limited resources, and by broader group size at that particular moment. A second, often underappreciated dimension is birth spacing pressure. In mobile hunter-gatherer contexts, carrying more than one nursing infant at a time posed a genuinely serious physical burden on a mother who also had to walk, forage, and often carry other belongings across considerable distances, which meant that the timing of one infant's illness relative to a sibling's needs could meaningfully affect the resources a community was able to direct toward care. A third dimension, easy to overlook but genuinely significant, is seasonality. Illness in infants was almost certainly not evenly distributed across the year. Respiratory and gastrointestinal conditions cluster around specific climates and food availability windows. And a sick infant arriving during a lean, late winter stretch was facing a considerably different set of group resources than one falling ill during a season of relative abundance. Bioarchaeologists studying seasonal stress markers in bone and teeth have found evidence consistent with this kind of cyclical nutritional pressure across numerous prehistoric populations, which suggests that timing, as much as severity, likely shaped how much a community could invest in any single sick child. All of this needs to be understood against the brutal practical backdrop of ancient life expectancy and labor demands. Pre-modern infant mortality rates, even under the best available care, are estimated by demographers to have been considerably higher than anything experienced in the developed world today, plausibly somewhere in the range of a third to half of all children not surviving to adulthood, depending on period and region. Adults themselves faced shorter average lifespans, heavier physical labor demands, and far less caloric surplus to draw on during a crisis. A modern parent bringing a sick infant to an emergency room is, in evolutionary terms, doing something almost unimaginably resource-rich. An ancient caregiver was often making an impossible calculation in real time: how many days of foraging labor can this group afford to redirect toward one sick child, and for how long, before the group itself becomes vulnerable. Care did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside genuinely severe constraints that shaped, without erasing, the underlying instinct to try. There's one more modern parallel worth bringing in here, because it mirrors the ancient pattern almost precisely. Research into caregiving behavior during modern humanitarian crises: famine, war, displacement consistently shows that even under extreme resource scarcity, caregivers overwhelmingly continue to prioritize sick and vulnerable children, often at direct cost to their own nutritional status, rather than abandoning care wholesale. This tells us something genuinely important. The instinct to protect a sick infant does not switch off under pressure. It bends, it strains, it sometimes fails tragically, but it does not disappear. That is, essentially, the same pattern etched into the bones at Windover Pond and into the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, just measured with modern instruments instead of trowels and translations. Step back from all of it for a moment, and something genuinely fundamental comes into focus. The fact that humans, across every culture and every era we have evidence for, have devoted such considerable attention, emotional, physical, intellectual, to the question of a sick child, says something about what we are as a species, independent of any particular civilization's technology or beliefs. This concern predates agriculture. It predates writing. It very likely predates our own species in something like its current form, given what we know about caregiving behavior in other hominins. Long before anyone could explain what a fever was, humans were already organized, biologically and socially, around trying to answer it. So, to directly answer the title's question, ancient humans, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, tried to care for sick infants using a genuinely cooperative, group-based support system that predates recorded history. Though that care operated within severe resource constraints and, in some contexts, gave way to selective non-investment when survival math left no better option. The key nuance to hold on to is threefold real variation existed between individuals, groups, and eras. The cultural packaging of that care changed enormously, from ochre and grave goods to papyrus formularies to modern neonatal medicine, and yet the underlying mechanism that pull toward a distressed infant stayed remarkably stable the entire time. Return, for a moment, to that fire in the limestone shelter. The woman holding the sick infant does not know what we know. She cannot picture a Mesopotamian tablet, or an Egyptian papyrus, or a modern incubator glowing quietly in a hospital ward thousands of years in her future. But the hand that reaches past her to bring water, the figure that shifts closer to share warmth, the whole quiet architecture of people orienting themselves around one small, struggling life that is already, unmistakably, the same thing happening in every nursery and hospital corridor since. Different fires, different tools, the same watching, the same reaching, carried forward, one sick child at a time, for as long as there have been humans to carry it.